The name of, first I'd like to ask everybody participating. The talk is called Connection Perception in its Propositional Attitudes Through an Active Framework. I'm going to quote the same book that Nara quote, Linguistic Bodies, and a few other works. This is a part of my current PhD research. Everything is very unfinished and open to revision, so criticisms are more than welcome. So the outline of the talk, I'm first talking about the enactive perspective in general, then what I call the enactive challenge, how to define the relation between perception and propositional perception attitudes. My initial goal when I began my PhD was to try to apply the enactive toolbox to questions of traditional epistemology. So I'm seeing how that can be done and cannot be done, and that is the main theme of this talk. Then I'm going to talk about the animal epistemology, using an expression from Moyal-Sharrock, and talking about considerations about the structure of rational evaluation made by Wittgenstein in uncertainty. Being a very unfinished work, I have some problem. There are some problems and questions in my proposal that I end the talk talking about them. So the enactive perspective, it is a history less than 30 years. It has some antecedents in philosophy and sciences, Merleau-Ponty, Husserl, Gibson. The beginning is usually traced to the publication of The Embodied Mind. Well, the core of the enactive reflection point here that was used in this talk. What do I take from enactivism? Very often the fact that minds occur in organisms, living systems, and the fact that minds exist in spatial, temporal, concrete circumstances are viewed as irrelevant or not as relevant to understanding of cognition. I borrow here the thesis of strict continuity between what we can call basic and higher cognition, as well as understanding of cognition as a property or characteristic of autonomous systems and what that entails. So, living systems are composed of a series of dynamic processes. They are related in a network in which every process depends on each other to occur. Being so closely connected, the process form a kind of unity recognizable in space and time. This unity recognizing space and time, the autonomous systems, what Varela calls the organisms. So cognition is something related to organisms, to autonomous systems. Different interactions of the unity with the environment have different demands. The idea is to continue to exist, self-individuate, keep its unity. Those demands become the demands or interests of the organisms. Again, as Nara has said, it's a new way of looking at bodies or looking at organisms, because we can talk of organisms in terms of plans and purposes. I'm quoting Linguistic Bodies, chapter 2. Organisms are natural purpose whose teleology is immanent. They follow purpose and norms that are their own. All the processes that make up the system are enabled by other processes of the system. No process is freestanding or self-sufficient. Here we have a sort of representation of what is the view. What is this? What will characterize this as organisms? Is there is a series of enabling processes very closely connected. And then we have other enabling process, like the sun, that is not connected to the network, that is external. So since organisms are like this, with internal purpose relating to self-maintenance, the engagement with the environment has value, at least a polar structure, regarding the continuation of the network of enabling relations. The organism Interaction with the environment must make sense of it. That's a general idea. This capacity is called sense-making, and it is central to the enactive understanding of cognition. Now, definition of sense-making. The capacity of autonomous systems to adaptively regulate its operation and its relation to the environment depending on the virtual consequences for its own viability as a form of life. Agreeing with the enactive approach, perception, memory, language are interpreted as forms of sense-making of the human form of life. In the case of language, as Nara says, a special kind of sense-making, participatory sense-making, but I'm not going to enter in details here. The way the sense-making operates as perception, this is one of the proposals, is a skillful activity of specification of information or energy structure, if we're going to use the vocabulary of ecological psychology, by means of sensimotor contingencies. In a neutral, non-trivial way, to perceive is to act, exercising more sensory-motor skills in an environment where there is something to be perceived. Autonomous systems adaptively regulate its operation and its relation to the environment by tracking environmental invariants. If information is a bad word, environmental invariant. When we have sensory-motor profiles, we have some form of perception. One quote, a famous quote in the literature, visual experience is a mode of activity involving practical knowledge about currently possible behaviors and associated sensory consequences. Visual experiences rests on know-how, the possession of skills. Some relevant background. The main problem of the enactive perspective, some say, is that it is unable to deal with the so-called representation hungry cases of cognition. To our purpose, we can understand representations as standings that have some degree of independence from the environment, being in the sense disembodied and not enactive. So the enactivism will not explain representational cognition. And the examples of representational cognition would be imagination, memory, planning, any language use in which the agent is engaging in an activity about something that might be absent, is not present, possible is not actual, or abstract, not concrete. Well, this generates scale-up differences for enactive research. First glance, the propositional attitudes of believing the P and knowing the P seem to be constituted by this type of standing state. The active theories of perception do not seem to affirm that all propositional knowledge, just like perception, will be reducible to the exercise of sensory-motor abilities. That would be to deny or dissolve the distinction between practical knowledge and propositional knowledge. There would be no difference between know-how and know-that. That doesn't seem to be the case. And if that is the case, a stronger argument needs to be given to motivate it. If we accept this relational theory of perception, the enactive theory of perception, the normative relation between perception and propositional attitudes cannot be understood as the manipulation of representations. Again, there's no representations in perception. The idea of rationality as something related to reasons, explicit considerations that bear in the truth of the proposition in question, does not even apply. Something not explored by Hurley is that the maintenance and orange of rationality can be in the looped action, perceptive action of the cognitive agents. That would be a new view of rationality to be developed. Also, the rationality cannot be understood as the articulation of concepts or the application of rules. If you are to understand concepts and rules in an over-intellectual way, they understand concepts and rules in exclusively propositionary terms. If you have the constraint of generality of Evans, we cannot talk about concepts and rules here. One way of answering that would be by saying the cognition involving semantic structures emerges for social cultural activities present in human life and maybe other great apes. That is the answer. That is how I understand the answer of Utu and Nin. They have what they call a duplex view. In perception, we don't have presentations, but we have representations because we have a social culture existence, or the difference of other animals. I'm going to quote Utu and Nin now. The establishment and maintenance of social cultural practice, those that make use of public representation systems, is in particular A for particular needs. That is the environment that we live. It is a representational environment. That is why we have representations and judgment. But here I would like to explore alternative. The idea that you can see language as a consequence of propositional attitudes as, and I quote, fundamentally enactive, and the emergence of language as a seamless extension of action. Here I see a paper by Moyal-Sharrock from 2019. How that would be? So what would be the animal in epistemology? That is my proposal following Moyal-Sharrock reading of Wittgenstein. Enactive strategies that have some support in the epistemic literature that emphasize action, behavior, and the exercise of skills to deal with classical epistemological problems. Approaches like Riles that prioritize practical knowledge as a way of stopping arguments of justificatory regress. Wittgenstein's insights and uncertainty about how to stop such skeptic arguments can be read as going in a direction similar to the inaction conceptions of cognition discussed prior. In this section, then, I discuss Wittgenstein's views and the interpretation given by Moyal-Sharrock, developing the first steps to what we can call an active or inactive interpretation of Hinge commitments. I'm going to explain what are Hinge commitments. I do not intend this to be an interpretation of Wittgenstein. I'm not interested in this. That is the view that Wittgenstein did hold. If it is not, that is not a problem for me. I'm just using as a launching pad. That's it. The central idea is there is a few commitments presupposed in every structure of rational evaluation. These commitments are related to a very peculiar type of certainty. Here I quote Wittgenstein. Now I would regard this certainty not as something akin to hastiness or superficiality, but as a form of life. By that, I means that I want to conceive it, this certainty, as something that lies beyond being justified or unjustified, as it were, as something animal. We can call these commitments, to which we are in some sense certain, Hinge commitments. Hinge commitments in this interpretation would be the unreflective ways of acting that looks like empirical propositions in heuristic context of philosophical reflection. I want to explain that. The ground of our knowledge is formed by these certainties, by these ways of acting in this interpretation. They make possible the structure of rational evaluation of our belief and knowledge. They are the starting point of any justificatory chain. One example. We cannot investigate the age of the Earth without acting as if the Earth exists. The Earth exists for quite some time. Time is a concept that is acquirable and includes measurements of age. Those sentences, according to this reading, are grammatical rules of the language game of geological investigation, are the certainties or ranging commitments of the activity. These ways of acting are verbalizing in context of conceptual analysis, so they look like empirical propositions or conceptual truths. That is the way, for instance, the Moyal-Sharrock explains away how Wittgenstein calls these Hinge propositions. Well, they look like propositions in empirical, in some context of heuristic analysis. In this reading of Wittgenstein's thought, there is a priority of entrenched modes of action in your process of acquiring knowledge and justification. It denies a certain presupposition of traditional epistemology, one that states that knowledge that and belief can only emerge from previous acquired knowledge or belief. This presupposition in Hinge form would be something like knowledge indeed emerges out of prior knowledge. Knowledge always has to be sort of logical relations with other pieces of knowledge, so it has to be propositional. Wittgenstein, in contrast, talks of a word picture or webpid and not a foundation of the same type their knowledge claims. Hinge commitments then can be understood as enablers of sense, as can the age of the Earth only makes sense if we engage in some practice as if we assume that the Earth exists for quite some time, if time is measurable in years. There are animal ways of interaction with the environment in what makes possible the formulation of knowledge and belief. As action is not something that is really out there, they are somehow what Wittgenstein, other authors calls a groundless ground. Quoting Wittgenstein again, given grounds, however, justifying the evidence comes to an end. But the end is not certain proposition striking us as immediately truth. It's not a kind of seeing on our part, it is our acting, which lies at the bottom of the language game.
Jeffrey, 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Beyond the grammatical rules, like the ones of the geological game, we think of different types of ranges. We can think of different types of ranges, including ones immersed, heavily suggested, if not determined, by the facts of experience. One example of such hinge is the certainty that I have a body. Quoting Moyal-Sharrock, paper of 2016. The hinge certainty verbalizes as I have a body is a disposition of a living creature which manifests itself in her acting in the certainty of having a body. Certainty is a way of acting, not a tacit belief. The hinge commitment that I have a body is present in very ordinary situations, if this reading is correct, like when someone grabs the towel of the handle, leaving the bath without much thought. I have a body is a sentence that in this context express certain commitments that underlie several activities that demand different levels of competence. By analogy, we can think of the certainty of a lion with the possession of this body. In both cases, ways of acting enable behavior that is more complex. The difference is noticeable and emerges when you look at the complex of behavior typically human. For example, the diction made possible by this range commitment. Because of the center that I have a body, I can make judgments like my back is hurting or I lost or I gained weight during the pandemic. Now the fun part, the end. Now we can make a connection between the hinge connected and basic cognition more explicit. I'm interested in a subset of hinge commitments, the one more directly connected to the general facts of nature, the ones who rooted in the more basic forms of life which humans participate. By accepting the enactive view of perception, they understand perception in terms of skills, and a reading of hinge commitments as the one Moyal-Sharrock attribute to Wittgenstein, we are allowed to argue in favor of the following. Perceptual skills are unreflected ways of acting that allows for the specification of environmental invariance. This perception involves the specialized ways of acting. They could be called, in the Wittgenstein vocabulary, hinge commitments or animal certainties. In this reading, the perception hinge commitments give legitimacy to perceptual propositional states by allowing the grasp of environmental information. In virtue of linguistic skills, the commitments are structured in semantic terms, in a perceptual proposition, for example. The observational empirical concepts have as enable conditions of acquisition certain practical skills. The skills in this reading are understood in an active manner in terms of sensomotor conditions and the tracking of environments. The propositional attitudes, or maybe linguistic cognitions for a better term, are extensions and development of the very basic animal way of interaction, interacting with the environment, instantiating and perception. So, the sophistication of it enabled by our capacity to have propositional attitudes should not obfuscate its concrete, embodied, and active oranges. I hope to have shown here there is a lot to be learned for enactivism, or at least a little. Not only more basic forms of cognition like perception, but also about the structure of knowledge and learning, acquisition and development of perceptual language and language as a whole. If my account was successful, we have reasons to import the enactive toolbox, sense-making, participatory sense-making, autonomous systems, skills and abilities related to sensory-motor conditions, to more traditional epistemology. Problems with that. I'm using sense-making as a sort of primitive epistemic relation, and it seems to the most similar conception in traditional epistemology is the notion of knowledge by acquaintance. Am I saying that sense-making, that the most sense-making is acquaintance, and that acquaintance is the most basic form of knowledge? That seems to be where my proposal is going, and I have some difficulties if that is what I'm saying. By having the second problem, or puzzlement, by having goals and purpose as central to the account of both sense-making and intelligent know-how, I am subscribing to a solely instrumental view of rationality because I'm not using the norm of truth. And our place is there for an account of propositional attitudes. Because it seems to me that with what I'm developing now, I'm less and less inclined to talk about knowledge and belief as propositional attitudes. To me, that is almost looking like a spiritual notion. So that is how that is all my research is leading to. And that is it. Thank you very much. Here are some.
Thanks, Jefferson. We have a question from Nitamar. Even if you are assuming some coherence view of knowledge and beliefs, do agree with Husserl's, Merleau-Ponty's, and phenomenologists' overall assumption that the living body is a 0 point for making sense of everything else, including language and sociality?
Thank you for the question, Tamar. The answer is, well, good. If I agree, now right now I'm inclined to agree with the enactivist research that takes this idea of phenomenology and applies as or the category of organism and environment are co-specified. It only makes sense talking about environments, talking about organisms. It only makes sense talking about organisms, talk about environments. That is something that Varela, for instance, argues using Buddhist philosophy that I don't know and phenomenology that I know very little. But the arguments are again, going to a metaphysics of processes, trying to argue in favor that the minimal unit of analysis are organisms and environments. So they are both, so agent and word, and the word of agents lives are co-specified.
Any more questions?
Yes, can I ask that?
Okay. Then
yeah.
Go ahead, Sophia.
There is time afterwards, after.
Thanks for your great talk. My question is about skills. And when you mentioned, or the second problem, your last slide, is it possible to put it back?
Sure.
Question is, are you rationalizing the know-how to do things in a real sense? I suppose not. Yes. So are you just instrumentalizing a view of rationality? I think you are not. Is it the case?
This question is motivated by the discussion that we found in some traditional epistemology about epistemic rationality. There is a type of rationality. Some argue that there is something like the norm of belief. Like belief is a mental state that is guided by the norm of truth, and since knowledge implies belief, knowledge is also guided by the norm of truth, and there's a whole discussion about this sui generis type of rationality, the epistemic rationality. And then this is usually people that deny that are accused of having a solely instrumental view of rationality. The rationality is a relation of means and to ends. But that is what motivates this puzzlement of mine.
Mhm. So if that's not the case, then what is the criteria of relevance to allow an organism to acquire the skills at this practical level?
I did not hear you very well.
I will write it down because the microphone is not working properly. So if Sophia wants to go on, I'm happy with your reply and I will write into the chat, okay? Thank you.
Sophia wrote here, which would be the role of language propositional in your account?
Yeah, of propositional language.
Counts.
Because if you link Wittgensteinian philosophy of language with an activist account of, I don't know, situated sense making, I don't grasp if you would still sustain that grammar has a central importance in how we explain rationality and communication or something like that. Can you follow?
I think so. My biggest problem in doing the research that one of the things that I was not satisfied with in activism was the answer that Utu-Imins give to what they call higher cognition, like representational cognition, then the other language and other things, the representation of hungry context. That is, and what I was trying to do is trying to do in my PhD research is see how we can connect language perception, how we can give a more full account of cognition that includes perception and linguistic cognition, like imagine, judgment, planning, without having to postulate the humans live in kind of two environments, because it seems like that is the proposal, because the basic idea of Utu-Imin is that when I see a cup, I have a process of basic cognition. I have a direct interaction, sensimotor patterns with the object. But when I think about a cup, then I'm kind of moving to my social. So I'm moving to my social environment, and I'm not very satisfied with that. And then I was trying to, reading linguistic bodies and in the proposal, see how we can understand the relation between the perception and language in a way that involves this kind of gaps and this kind of functional discontinuity is how the Utu-Imin describes. I don't know if I answer your question.
Yeah, I think part of it, but my question, I don't want you to develop anymore, it's okay, but my question is related to grammar, because traditional semantics is very, so it's very worried about structure and grammar, and logic, obviously. So I can't really see how to merge these new accounts that you are sustaining and with this kind of logical analysis or propositional analysis that was traditional in analytic philosophy. I wonder how to do that.
I can say that in linguistic bodies, that Nara was talking earlier, they have to me a kind of, they have the beginnings of explanation of grammar and recursivity. by the way of the idea of reporting and incorporating utterances. The idea is that in the practice of giving utterances and understanding, interpreting utterances, in the complexity, again, the idea of applying dynamic systems theory to explain cognitive phenomena, and the complexity of the interaction, certain patterns were surging. They even use an expression like the more complex is the text, the more complex is the activity, the more grammatical it becomes. The idea is that in the flow of interaction, certain utterance becomes more useful. Oh, if I do this, people stop. Okay, so I'm going to continue in that, and that over time, the interaction will form those patterns and rules of grammar.
So it's the start of an answer by them. Yes, I understand. Yes, thank you.
Thanks, Jefferson.